Happy Easter!
Happy Easter! Happy Upside Down Groundhog Day!
Happy Upside Down Glasses Day!
Happy
Bye!
It's Ranking Day! Bye!
It's not Ranking Day. Oh, and like St. Patrick's.
See you next week.
My making toys. Mommy. Daddy,
Something's losing connection.
Daddy.
Alright. Sorry. We took a few minutes because I keep hearing a dinging noise and I don't know what the dinging noise is. So if you hear that, I apologize. Maybe it is fixed now. If not, we'll just try to get through it. We're going to continue with the cast of the cross this week. And this week we're talking about John. And we're going to start by reading the little excerpt from the book that I like to do. And it says, John was fighting a nauseating feeling in his stomach. He didn't know why he was hanging around to see this. All the others left a long time ago. He had seen it all. The supper, the prayers in the garden, the arrest and subsequent clashes with the council, the pitiful excuse for a trial before Pilate, the mockery, the scourging, and now this. John looked up at his Lord. He was barely recognizable, but there was no doubt this was Jesus. The mercy and love that drew him to his teacher 3 years ago was only magnified by the cross. He decided to stay. If Jesus could suffer and die for his sins, he could at least stay and witness it. He determined to record all of this when it was over so that anyone who read it might believe in the Savior. This was the least he could do. He was a disciple whom Jesus loved. Okay, so all this chapter, or all today's Devo, this chapter is about John. So we're going to do a little background information on John first. John was the son of Zebedee. John was a fisherman, and he was a fisherman until the day he became an apostle. And he was a fisherman with his family. It was a family business. So him and his father, that's what they did for a living. And as a fisherman, what I read meant you were uneducated. He did not have an education. He just caught fish for a living. And then we know Jesus called him out to be an apostle. And that's when his life changed. And we know that John, he lived in Capernaum. And I did not, I guess, put two and two together, did not know this. But in Capernaum, that's where Jesus cast out demons. Jesus healed the sick. Capernaum wasn't far from the place where Jesus fed the 5,000. So Capernaum should have known about Jesus, should have known the things he was doing. The people saw all of this. They saw Jesus cast out the demons. They saw Jesus heal the sick. They saw Jesus feed the 5,000. They heard about all this, but they still didn't believe. And John falls into that group. He did not believe. But even though he did not believe, guess what? Jesus chose him to be an apostle. So what does that mean? Which we all know, you don't have to be perfect. Jesus didn't pick the best of the best. He didn't pick only the high class people. He didn't pick only the educated. He didn't pick only the best of the best. Here was a fisherman, uneducated fisherman, that Jesus chose to become apostle. And more than that, he did not believe in Jesus. Did not. And yet he was chosen. So what was John's role in the crucifixion? Okay, we have this man. We talked a little bit about him, but why was he chosen? What was his role? And he was the only one who stuck it out to the end. Now, I say that when we talked about the 5 women that were there. He was the only apostle, the only one that didn't bail, that didn't leave. He never left. And that is what John is known for. John is known for his loyalty to Jesus. So we're going to talk about some things about John. First, he shared Jesus' last meal. And we see this in John 13, verses 23. It says, one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at a table at Jesus' side. So, this is the first time we see John being called the one whom Jesus loved. This disciple whom Jesus loved is referred to as John. John is this disciple. Well, and they do this because this is the time where all the other apostles started backing away. Okay, they know something bad's coming. They don't want to be a part of it. They're starting to have their doubts. They're starting to get a little bit scared, I guess, in my words. But this is the time John's relationship with Jesus grew closer. He was getting closer as the other 11 were backing farther away from Jesus. Secondly, John was in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prayed. And we see this in Matthew 26, verses 37 through 45. And it says, and taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, which we know was John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed in the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So we see in these verses, John was there in the garden where Jesus prayed. He was one of the few that were there. Next, John witnessed Jesus' trials. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door, so the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl, and who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. John heard the false testimony, saw the ridicule, and watched as they led Jesus to the slaughter. So he witnessed all this. He heard the false testimony, he saw the ridicule, and then he watched as they led him to the slaughter. He didn't bail then, like the other ones. The next thing John did is he stood beside the cross. John 19, 26 and 27 says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. This was John. John's there. Jesus looks down. John, take care of my mother. Mother, this is the person who's going to take care of you. Powerful. What a responsibility. Jesus' mother. And you are now responsible for taking care of her. And that is where John's role comes in. When we think of Mary, she's hurting. And what happens when people are hurting? Sometimes when we are hurting, we just need someone to be there. We just need someone to be there. And that was John for Mary. But that was also, to John, that was Jesus. He needed someone there. When Jesus was hurting, John was there for him. John was there for Mary. So, we have all this background. John was there for all the big events. John wasn't a believer, still isn't a believer to this point. So, what did all these things do? What did seeing all of this do? How did it change John? Well, number one, after Jesus died, after he did that cruel death on the cross, he became a believer. And we see that when they went back to the tomb. When Mary Magdalene came and told Peter and John that Jesus was gone, they went running back. Not walking, not, oh, we'll get there in a few minutes. Oh, we don't believe you. They ran. John ran to the tomb. and saw that Jesus really wasn't there. And it was then he believed. It was after Jesus breathed his last breath. And it wasn't even then. He stood there and watched it. He was there until Jesus took his last breath, and he still didn't believe. He didn't believe until Mary Magdalene came and said, hey, he's gone. And when he went running the tomb and saw with his own eyes there wasn't a body there anymore, he believed. It took all of that, and he believed. John saw all that had happened leading up to this, and now he saw Jesus was risen, and he became a believer. So now that he's a believer, what did John do? First, and we're not going to read these verses, the next two things I'm just going to give you all list. The first thing he did when he became a believer, he became the disciple whom Jesus loved. And we see that in John chapter 13, verse 23. We see that in John 19, verse 26. We see that in John 20, verse 2. John 21, verse 7. And 20 to 23, verses 20 to 23 of 21. He became the disciple who Jesus loved. What else did John do? He wrote 5 books. He wrote John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation. The next thing he did, and the last thing he did, he became the last living apostle. So when he became a believer, he went on and carried on all the stories of Jesus, told people about Jesus, and you got to think, he was a living, walking non-believer. Didn't believe all these things, but yet he was still, when Jesus called him to follow him, he didn't say no. He took upon that. Again, we're uneducated, so we're following this perfect, righteous man. We're the only one that didn't bail, and we watched him breathe his last breath. We were one of the very few that were at the tomb when he was risen and he wasn't there. And it changed his life. It changed his life. And he lived the rest of his life telling people about Jesus. And we know in Revelation 1:9 that he died an old man exiled on the Isle of Patmos. It says, I, John, your brother, and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So he lived his life. He was telling people about Jesus. And he died. He was one of the last, he was the last living apostle. So the whole point of this devotional, the whole point of why John was at the cross, what can John do for us? Well, here it is in a nutshell, one sentence. John started out like all of us. He was flawed. He was mixed up, and he was confused. Anybody listening to this devotional, we have been those 3 things. We might be those 3 things. At some point in our life, before we were a Christian, while we were a Christian, we are those 3 things. We're all flawed. We all get mixed up, and we are all confused at certain times. But what happened to John? The cross changed his soul. The cross changed him. He became a believer. So all I want you to do this week is think about, how has the cross changed us? How were we like John in the beginning? And how can we be, how are we, how should we be like John now? Next week we talk about the centurion. And that's all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you all here next week.